This is part 2 of my series on the pistol, which examines the revolver. My name is Norm Cairns. I wrote this book, Mistakes, Misstatements, Lies, and Other Miscommunication Tactics. It's for sale on various sites. I am a former journalist, a former federal prosecutor, and I am currently a private investigator. But for purposes of this video, I am an NRA pistol instructor, qualified to teach 3 courses, a concealed carry instructor, a level 3 armed security professional, and an expert marksman. My previous video in this series dealt with the development of firearms and the flintlock. This video covers the development of repeating firearms. The first revolving cylinder flintlocks appeared in the 16th century, but these were incredibly dangerous. They were almost as likely to explode and kill the shooter as they were to fire and hit the intended target. The British kept developing the concept, and by the 18th century they had developed what was at least a relatively safe gun to shoot, but the cylinder had to be rotated by hand. While perhaps an improvement on the traditional flintlock, they were extremely expensive to produce, and again, the shooter had to rotate the cylinder by hand. We now return to the United States. Much of the history of firearms is from the United States. This is not my prejudice toward the United States, although I am prejudiced toward the United States, having served the country for more than 20 years. In reality, the United States quickly became the most warlike nation on earth. If you look at our 250-year history as a country, there have been relatively few years of peace. The United States has been almost constantly at war, and as a result, firearms often develop more rapidly here than in Europe. At this time, a legendary firearms designer enters our story, and his name is Samuel Colt. Colt was on a business trip and was on his way home via ship. As you would expect, at the time, there was no direct TV, internet, or anything else on the ship to entertain Colt, so he studied the mechanisms of the ship. He was particularly fascinated by the windlass. A ship's windlass works as a winch with a geared barrel or wildcat rotated by a motor or manual cranks to lift or lower an anchor and its chain by winding the chain around a grooved wheel or gypsy, which grips the chain link. The motor or crank rotates a gear train, increasing the force from the power source to turn the wildcat and pull the anchor aboard or to let it out. A clutch disengages the wildcat for free fall, while a strong brake controls the descent and holds the anchor secure. Colt watched the mechanism and theorized that the same type of mechanism would stop the rotating cylinder of a firearm. He was right, and the result was the Colt Patterson in 1832. It was the first real revolver. I do not own a Colt Patterson. This is an 1851 Colt Navy revolver. It's not in firing condition and will probably never be in firing condition. I replaced the grips because the old ones had disintegrated. There's a naval battle engraved on the cylinder, which on this one you can barely see. The battle was between the United States Navy and the Mexican Navy during the Mexican-American War. Even though the pistol doesn't work, it gives you a view into how the pistol did work. This is a black powder revolver, so the shooter still had to load each cylinder by hand. He or she would pour the powder into the cylinder, place wadding if they used any, and then the ball. This device on the bottom is a ramrod that seats the ball and the powder. It was cumbersome to reload, but once loaded, the shooter had 6 shots that could be fired in rapid succession. The United States Marine Corps was originally trained for a different mission than the one it performs mostly today. Marines were always trained to make landings on foreign shores and fight like soldiers, but Marines were also trained in ship-to-ship combat. Often it was better to take a ship than to sink it because ships were worth a lot of money. So if an American warship was able to get close enough to an enemy which was perhaps disabled and were able to throw grappling hooks onto it, United States Marines would swarm over the decks of the enemy's ship, killing or subduing the crew. For obvious reasons, this was some of the worst combat known to man. The Navy pistol is very different from the Colt Army pistol. For one thing, it doesn't really have a sight. It has a brass bead on the front of the pistol. The sight is cut into the hammer, the thought being that on the deck of a rolling ship, at very close quarters, sights were not that useful. But if a United States Marine landed on the deck of your ship with one of these in his hand, you were in a lot of trouble because he had 6 shots and each one would blow a man apart. Unlike the Army pistol, the Navy has a short grip, so if the Marine ran out of shots, he could turn the pistol around and use it as a club. In 1851, a British soldier developed the first double-action revolver. So let's talk about double action. The concept is simple. When you pull the trigger of a single-action revolver, it only does one thing: drops the hammer, whereas the trigger on a double-action revolver does more than one thing. With this Colt Navy pistol, you had to pull the hammer back to fire the pistol. With a double-action revolver, you can just pull the trigger and the gun will do all the work for you. While an interesting feature and something that might be useful in an emergency, double action is actually not very useful. Here's why. All modern revolvers are double action. This is a Colt King Cobra. The truth is that given a choice, you will never fire a revolver in double action mode. Here's why. Using your trigger finger to pull the gun through the entire mechanism throws off your aim, whereas in single fashion, the only thing that happens when you pull the trigger is the hammer falls and the pistol fires, so your aim is not affected. Back to Sam Colt. There was an engineer who worked for Colt. His name was Roland White. He approached Colt and said, "We have the ball, the powder, and the cap." I neglected to mention earlier that Colt's revolver was fired with a cap, which attached by a nipple on the back of the cylinder. The engineer said, "Why don't we put that all together into a single package?" Colt said, "I think it's a bad idea." While 2 other men thought it was a good idea, and their names were Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson. Now I know some people in the comments will probably say that cartridge ammunition predated Smith and Wesson, but they were usually paper cartridges, not metal ones, and Smith and Wesson, with White's patent, developed the bored-through cylinder where the firing pin would reach the cartridge. So in my opinion, Smith and Wesson invented cartridge ammunition along with Roland White. Cartridge ammunition was a huge success, and Smith and Wesson held the patents on its design, so it would be many years before Colt could make one. Eventually he designed the Colt Single-Action Army, which is one of the most famous guns of all time. The most expensive pistol ever sold at auction was the Colt Single-Action Army pistol that Pat Garrett used to kill Billy the Kid. I find this ironic, as Pat Garrett was a coward who killed the kid while the kid was half asleep in a hotel room. If this conversation seems esoteric, it is hard to overstate the impact that these weapons had on American history. The revolver and the Henry repeating rifle were the first metal cartridge repeating firearms that were reliable and easy to reload. These were monstrous weapons to our enemies. John Gatling, also an American, invented what could be considered the first machine gun. Now, it's not a true machine gun by modern standards because it did not use recoil from the firearm to reload itself. It was operated by a crank, but its effects were the same. So Colt and Smith & Wesson continue to make revolvers, and they make the finest ones on earth to this day. But revolvers are expensive because they are typically made of solid steel. In the next part of this series, we will discuss the semi-automatic pistol. We will return to Europe for some history. In the 20th century, advanced pistol development kind of stagnated in the United States because Americans became obsessed with one particular pistol and can never let go of it, we will also introduce you to a man who was perhaps the most brilliant firearms engineer in the history of firearms, John Browning.